Lovely. Everybody can hear me okay? Yes? I'm going to assume so. It's nice to see you all. I'm sorry I can't be with you, but I'm really glad that I have the chance to be able to come in over the Zoom to speak with you today. So everybody can see my slides, is that correct? Could someone just raise their hands if they can see my slides? Yes, excellent. Okay, thumbs up. Lovely, lovely. Okay, thank you. So we have well, originally scheduled about an hour and a half, and so I'll talk for some portion of that, but I should be able to leave plenty of time for discussion and dialogue. So please do bear your questions in mind as we continue. Okay, global structures, individual endeavors. And I have the slides here, and I'm beginning with this image. Does anybody happen to be able to recognize any of these three people? No? Well, I'll tell you, you're in for a treat. So on the left is Justice Robert Jackson, U.S. Supreme Court Justice. On the right is First Lady of the United States, Eleanor Roosevelt. And let me just pause for a moment. So I'm getting some feedback. Okay, I think the feedback has gone away. My apologies. In the middle is one of the really pivotal actors in world history, a Ukrainian person, Ludmila Pavlichenko. Perhaps you've heard of her. She is sometimes better known as Lady Death. She is one of the most successful and decorated snipers in all of world history and was an absolutely pivotal actor, individual who fought quite courageously in the context of the Second World War. And I'm beginning with this image because they are here in the United States on a tour in 1942. And the context, of course, is that the Soviet Union was desperate for the Western allies, the UK and the US, to open up a robust second front against the Nazi war machine here in 1942. And so, in order to try to drum up political support for this, they brought Ludmila Pavlichenko over to the United States. She was the first Soviet citizen, to be received in the US White House. And then she went on a tour with the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, to try to have people understand what it was really like on what was called, of course, the Eastern Front and the importance of the Allies working together to try to stop this horrific war machine. And I have known about her for some time and often teach about her to my students, partly because it defies so many of our kind of expectations, both about the role that women did play in this conflict, but also, crucially, about the role that individuals who aren't necessarily elite figures, elite leaders, but more ordinary types of people, and how they can do extraordinary things that really have a decisive role in world politics. So I wanted to start with this image because I wanted to emphasize the point that global politics is made up of people like you, people like me, not just these types of figures here, of course, famously in Yalta, in Ukraine, carving up the world, as it were. And of course, we see these scenes and we have to tell stories about these scenes. We have to understand these things. But I want to start here today by emphasizing that this is not the sum total of global politics. These are not the only individuals matter. Many other individuals, people like you and me, can matter as well. Okay, so in preparing for this, I'm conscious that we've worked together in the past. I didn't want to just give you some of the old things that we had before. This is not really a training session. I'm conscious this is a kind of retreat, a reunion, a chance for everybody to get together. So this talk is going to be a little less technical and it's going to be a bit broader. And I'm going to help you think about the role that individuals have played and can play in shaping the world. I'm going to cover some material which is going to be a bit dark and a bit difficult. So I hope that you'll be able to bear with that because ultimately, of course, I want to tell much happier stories and strike some really strong notes of optimism. But let me back up for a moment and begin with this timeless debate between liberal and realist approaches to international relations. Let me just pause for a moment before I get underway on this. Everything going well so far? You can all hear me. The slides are working. So far, so good. I see, I see a thumbs up. Excellent. Great. Okay. So many of you, of course, are familiar with this concept of realism. And realists describe the world as it is in all of its dark and quite disappointing ways. Liberals, on the other side, dare to imagine the world as it could be. And if we think about the liberals across time, these are the people who imagined that we could live in a world where all people enjoyed their natural rights to believe, to think, to act independently. They were the movements that said that people should be allowed to criticize their governors. And of course, that everybody, regardless of their race, ethnicity, gender identity, background, level of class, should be able to vote, that we should stop denying the vote to all these different people. And of course, we know that they were successful. We've made progress as a species. The world is less bad because these people believed that it was possible to change the world. But at the time, of course, across centuries, the realists out there were doubting it. And it was realistic to say, we're not going to be able to have a universal franchise where everybody gets to vote. We're not going to really have a say in our governments. Democracy will never work. But the liberals, of course, believed it was possible, and then they made it happen. Now, that's not to say it's easy, of course, right? We cannot have progress without striving, without sacrifice. And I'm very conscious of the striving and sacrifice of all of you in the room in Ukraine have already made to try to preserve this progress and see further progress. That's not lost on me. And of course, these days, one of the really important liberal causes is to ensure that the rights of minorities and small communities, smaller powers, smaller countries, a country like Ukraine, we can finally recognize and actually respect the rights. So it's not just a world where powerful actors get to do what they like and the rest of us just have to suffer. So that's the basic tension between liberalism and realism. Let me go a little more deeply into realism, then briefly talk a bit about how it's being applied to the debates about the politics in Ukraine today, before I go on to then go deeper into liberalism and then tell some stories that I hope you'll find uplifting. But I have to begin, unfortunately, with this kind of simplistic and dark view of the world that we get from the realists. And there are a couple key elements. The first is that they're deeply pessimistic about human nature. They believe that we're always in competition, and they openly question whether international institutions can do anybody any good. But let's start with this very stark and dark view of human nature. The basic story, according to the various kinds of realists, is that people like us really can't do much in the face of international structures. They insist that international relations, global politics, is ultimately exclusively power politics. So I alluded to the classic line from the Malian Dialogue, one of the oldest texts that we still have in the world today, several thousand years old. And we have this incredible story of the island of Milos, which was getting caught up in this great conflict, some of you might know, between Athens and Sparta in what was called the Peloponnesian War. And the small island just wanted to be neutral. They didn't want to have to side with either Athens or Sparta. But Athens comes to them and insists, you must take a side, you must join us or die. And there's the famous line delivered by Pericles, the leader of the Athenians. Right is only in question between equals in power, while the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. This is a very dark, quote unquote, realist view. Fast forward several centuries, several thousand years, and in the wake of the Second World War, of course, the realists it was very easy for them to talk about how bad human nature could, of course, become. This is Hans Morgenthau in Politics Among Nations. He explains that this is innate, this is part of human nature. The tendency to dominate is an element of all human associations, from family through local political organizations to the state. Both domestic and international politics are a struggle for power, modified only by the different conditions under which this struggle takes place in the domestic and international spheres. Whatever the ultimate aims of international politics, power is always the immediate aim. Whenever statesmen and peoples strive to realize their goals by means of international politics, they do so by striving for power. The aspiration for power being the distinguishing element of international politics, as of all politics, international politics is of necessity power politics. Now, of course, you can imagine that in 1948, a lot of people, understandably, had very dark views about what global politics could and would produce. Morgenthau's point here is that there's something wrong with our species. It's just rooted in our nature to compete with each other and to try to get more powerful than others. Whatever it is we're trying to do, we always need power. And so we're locked in this endless struggle from children around the dinner table fighting to get a word in edgewise or to get parental approval or attention, up through, of course, the international system. Humans are always locked in these struggles for power and for domination. So the realists begin with this very pessimistic view about what we as a species ultimately can do. It's just a brutal world. More to the point, perhaps, is that we also are locked in eternal competition because there's just not enough resources for all of us. Now, of course, many people at many points have questioned why we need to have war at all. Why can't we just get along? Surely, we know at this point, and all of you know better than I, war is so immensely costly in so many ways. Why can't we just find a way to share peace and prosperity? Why do we get into these wars and find ourselves having to fight them? Well, realists say it's inevitable. It's inevitable because we're bad species, we're violent by nature, and it's inevitable because we fight in eternal competition for scarce resources. So this is E.H. Carr, one of the famous realists. He's writing here in the late 1930s, the 20 Years crisis, the interwar period from the end of the First World War to then the start of the Second World War. And he goes after the so-called utopian thinking that suggests that it's possible for us to share without violence. He writes, we must reject as an inadequate and misleading the attempt to base international morality on an alleged harmony of interests. The inner meaning of the modern international crisis, again in 1939, is the collapse of the whole structure of utopianism based on the concept of the harmony of interests. Now, consider how this plays out today in Europe. This is Frank-Walter Steinmeier, who was president of Germany. And note I put in blue the date, 2008. He's talking about Ostpolitik, which is the German word for sort of Eastern political endeavors. And he's describing here in 2008 the plans by the European Union to cooperate with Vladimir Putin to try to create economic interdependence in the hope that this would soften Russia's ambition, that it would give them a real stake in the peace and prosperity of Europe. So in 2008, he's describing this move across the 1990s and the first decade of the early 2000s. He says, what Ostpolitik in fact achieved was to make peace in Europe more secure. For the democracy movements in Eastern Europe, it created new possibilities, new scope for action. It was a key factor in finally ending the confrontation between the Eastern and Western blocs. Now again, 2008, they were patting themselves on the back. We solved this problem. We know what to do. We know how to help the people of Eastern Europe have their own countries, not be dominated by Russia. We solved this through economic interdependence. Well, of course, you all know what happened in 2014, and then, of course, the all-out invasion in 2022. Wolfgang Schäuble, the former German finance minister, by the summer, they were, of course, reversing. We were patting ourselves on the back. We thought we had found a way to solve the Putin problem, but I was wrong. We were all wrong. And of course, you know that story far better than I do. So according to these more realistic so-called perspectives, E.H. Carr, Wolfgang Schäuble these days, economic integration does not necessarily reduce aggression, and it gives us the false promise, the false hope that it will do so. Okay, so again, as I say, these are some dark views, and I do apologize for that, but I want to be able to show you the ways in which these realists are describing the world so that then you can better appreciate the alternative perspective that I'll offer from the perspective of the liberals. There's one more bit of nasty business we have to cover here, the so-called false promise of international institutions. Some of you probably know John Mearsheimer, know of John Mearsheimer. I'll come to his specific discussions of Ukraine shortly. But even before we get to 2014, before we get Russia's invasions, John Mearsheimer was already in the 1990s deprecating, denigrating international institutions. He writes, liberal institutionalism does not directly address the question of whether international institutions cause peace, but instead focuses on the less ambitious goal of explaining cooperation in cases where state interests are not fundamentally opposed. The theory is of little relevance in situations where states' interests are conflictual and neither side thinks it has much to gain from cooperation. Realists maintain that international institutions are basically a reflection of the distribution of power in the world. They are based on the self-interested calculations of the great powers, and they have no independent effect on state behavior. My central conclusion is that institutions have minimal influence on state behavior. So Mearsheimer, if you've heard of him, you've probably heard his justifications, as it were, from a realist perspective on what's happening in your country today. So let's take the realist view and see how it's been applied, I think incorrectly, but how it has been applied by the realists. So in the world, of course, we have these various structural features, these key elements that make it very difficult for us to achieve peace or for us to sustain development or for us to be able to cooperate. These elements that make our individual aspirations so difficult to achieve. And this is just a list of several of them more broadly, and I'll explain how they get applied to Ukraine in a moment. So anarchy, of course, is the absence of overarching political power. And my heart goes out to all of you because you're stuck in this system where you have Putin on one side and then you have Donald Trump on the other. And Donald Trump is a really problematic person. And of course, we know from his personal record and his political record, his business record, he is not somebody that we can place a lot of faith in. He's not a man of his word. And he is obviously clearly very unreliable. But in an anarchic system, there's nobody to turn to. It's a so-called self-help system. You have to help yourselves. But for larger powers, it often feels like a self-help system in that they can help themselves to whatever they like. We also have the existence of exit options for market actors. So we can't always just keep markets working the way we want. Often we end up competing with markets as our political policies cut against their interests. There is, of course, the distribution of power among states. It's obviously hugely varies. And that, as you know better than I, creates all kinds of challenges. And then there are these questions about the scope and influence of international regimes, international organizations, institutions. And so in the case of Ukraine, it's a very tough situation indeed. Without having an overarching world government to ensure justice, will the people of Ukraine achieve justice? Will justice be done for them? Will they be able to ensure justice for themselves? How can Ukraine retain its entrepreneurs, attract foreign investors, right? This whole program for several years now is Education for Victory. We've been working hard together to try to find a way to strengthen civil society, to ensure your economy continues to do well, and of course, to try to support the people who are involved in the fighting itself. But one of the challenges, as you well know, is that in this difficult context, it can be hard to retain all of your entrepreneurs and to try to attract foreign investors. How can we ensure that smaller states have their rights respected, that they don't become the prey for larger predatory neighbors? We have these international regimes, the EU, NATO, the United Nations, but as you know so well, they often make promises, they often suggest things should happen, but they're really not done well on the follow through, especially recently. I want to emphasize here my own limitations because they are substantial. I'm really out of my depth in discussing the specifics of your ongoing struggles. Obviously, I read the news. I've learned a lot from all of you, but I just don't have the same firsthand knowledge and experience. So I hesitate to try to give you a lecture literally about what's going on in Ukraine when I think all of you know much better than I do. But I have been learning some things. And as I say, I've learned a lot from my conversations with all of you over the last few years. And my view is that this realist story is easy to tell, but it's far too simplistic. It's inaccurate, and I think it's too pessimistic. So let's go back to Mearsheimer for a moment. He essentially engages in victim blaming. Here he's being quoted by another set of authors I'll introduce you to in a moment. But as they write, his central point is that US foreign policy was geared to transform Ukraine into a Western bulwark on Russia's border by pushing it closer to NATO, championing its EU integration, and financing Ukrainian democracy. According to Mearsheimer's monocausal narrative, the result was that Putin and Russia felt actively threatened. So it's, according to Mearsheimer, it's Ukraine's fault. It's the West's fault that Putin felt threatened and needed to engage in these invasions. That's a straightforward realist application of realist theory to your country. Now, I think that's entirely wrong. And part of the reason I think that's wrong is my experiences with you, but also careful studies and analysis done by other scholars. This is Veronica Engel, who is a scholar at the European University Institute in Florence in Italy, but she herself is from Galați, which you probably know is in the most eastern part of Romania. That's where she's from and grew up. And it's on the border with Moldova and, of course, Ukraine. And she is a scholar of Eastern Europe. And so I've learned a lot from her and her scholarship in trying to better understand your story. Now, she, together with Dietland Stoll, have written this, I think, resounding rebuttal to Mearsheimer's realist application of realist theory to the situation of Ukraine. So I'll quote a little bit from them and highly encourage you, if you're interested, to go and look at more of her work. She writes, they write, the picture of a United States determined to bring Ukraine into NATO and committed to aggressive NATO expansion is not supported by facts. Putin himself has referred repeatedly to the idea of a divided ancient Russian world, Ruski Mir, and highlighted Russia's aspirations to restore unity. In June of 2021, he claimed Ukrainians and Russians are one people and that Russia and Ukraine are a single country. Of course, you all know this. You know this very well, that infamous speech that set the groundwork for the subsequent all-out invasion. But while much of Eastern Europe was pounding at NATO's door, they were often invited to knock more softly so as to not disturb the neighbors. It was not until Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 that NATO member states, slowly and indecisively, realized the necessity to invest in securing the eastern flank. In many ways, Ukrainians and East European NATO member states have reasons to wish Mearsheimer were right in his view of history. US and NATO overcommitment to these countries and a peaceful, non-colonizing Russian agenda sound great to East European ears. Now, again, this is a person from Eastern Romania, so she's speaking for herself here. Unfortunately, this is a faulty vision. So again, I am out of my depth here, but learning from you, learning from other scholars, it seems very clear to me that Putin is obviously wrong, normatively wrong, descriptively wrong, historically wrong. He has it wrong. But I think I get very frustrated indeed with scholars, people like John Mearsheimer, who buy Putin's simplistic, dark justifications for what is very clearly an unjust war of aggression. Hey, the world is rough, there's competition, human nature is terrible. Putin has to do this, right? Because he needs to protect his borders. I just think that's a bunch of absolute bullshit. I think that it's a terrible justification, it's simplistic, and it's just factually wrong. So let's pivot now and let's talk about a different way to see some of these events and to see the possibilities that a liberal perspective offers for Ukraine and for our world. So I described realism as simplistic and dark, and I think after these slides, you perhaps all would agree with that characterization. The liberal perspective, by contrast, is aspirational and is progressive. So we begin with timeless natural law. And I'm going to go all the way back to Hugo Grotius, one of the so-called founders of modern international law theory. And I'm going to go to Grotius partly because, I mean this, and this is absolutely true. When I read Grotius or when I teach Grotius, I very often find myself thinking about and teaching students using Ukrainian people as exemplary of much of what Grotius has to say. I mean, this is 400 years ago, Grotius was writing these things, and I haven't seen many better characterizations of how international law actually works than the example that all of you are providing in Ukraine these days. So let me give you some of the key words from Grotius, and I'll sort of explain why all of you come to mind when I read and teach Grotius. So Grotius argued that man is an animal, but one of a very high order, and that excels all the other species of animals much more than they differ from one another, as the many actions proper to only to mankind demonstrate. Now, amongst these things, peculiar to man is his desire of society, a certain inclination to live with those of his kind, not in any manner, but peaceably. Therefore, the saying that every creature is led by nature to seek its own private advantage must not be granted. He goes on and he says, people who violate the laws of nature and the laws of nations break down the bulwarks of their future happiness and tranquility. Besides, there were no profit to be expected from the observation of right, yet it would be a point of wisdom, not folly, to obey the impulse and direction of our own nature. Grotius's point is that actually we're not such a terrible species. We actually want to live together with other people peacefully. Most people don't want to be on their own. They don't want to live a solitary life. And they don't want to be perennial fights, perennial struggles. Now, of course, these things happen, but that is the exception to our nature. That's not who we really are. And we need to find ways to recognize and celebrate that. It's cheap. It's easy to find people fighting and say, see, we're a terrible species. This is all we can have in the world. It's just people fighting all the time. That's easy to say. But the reality, of course, is that most people don't live that way. Most people want to get on well with their neighbors. And let's not forget that. Grotius also writes that neither does right lose all its effect by being destitute of the assistance of force. For justice brings peace to the conscience. Injustice racks and torments. Justice is approved of, injustice condemned by the consent of all good men. Now, I know it's easy for me to say these things, safe here in Wales, in the UK, as I am, all of you there in a country that's literally being bombed at the very moment. But Grotius would have us remember that we, as humans, don't want to be on the wrong side of the conflict. All of you, despite the bombing, sleep well because you understand, you know that you aren't the aggressors, that you're defending yourselves. And some of the material I see from captured soldiers fighting on the Russian side, many of these people clearly are not sleeping so well. Their consciences are not clean. And that might not be enough, of course, to prevent war. But Grotius wants us to remember the importance, the value of being just and what it means for our own long-term psychological health. Now, realists, as we saw, argue that power trumps justice, that powerful actors get to determine what is right and what's wrong. And Grotius doesn't just say that's wrong. He actually argues that being on the right side actually engenders power. It gives you power in a variety of ways. He writes, how great force in wars is the consciousness of the justice of the cause historians everywhere show, who often ascribe victory chiefly to this reason. Hence the proverbial sayings, a soldier's courage rises or falls according to the merit of his cause. Seldom does he return safely who took up arms unjustly. Now, again, when I first read about the North Korean conscripts being sent to fight against your countrymen, your countrywomen, your fellow Ukrainians, and then we saw details of their horrible state, their lack of preparation, their confusion. That's what Grotius was talking about, as opposed to the people fighting in the Ukrainian side who are fighting with courage because they understand that they're fighting on the just side. This is just the tip of the iceberg, of course. The Russian soldiers, the others fighting on Russia's side, right, are very much like those poor, lost, conscripted North Koreans, deeply confused about what they're doing and why they're doing it, fighting out of fear, not out of a love of justice, not courageously with truth on their side. Grotius also emphasizes that bad actors are often ostracized and sometimes even justly punished by the community of nations. He says, right has not interest merely for its end. There is no state so strong or well provided, but what may sometimes stand in the need of foreign assistance, either in business or commerce, or to repel the joint forces of several foreign nations confederate against it. For which reason we see alliances desired by the most powerful nations and princes, the whole force of which is destroyed by those that can find right within the limits of each state. So true is it that the moment we recede from right, we can depend upon nothing. Now, again, Ukraine comes to mind very much for me when I read these words. Putin's Russia is increasingly an ostracized power. I know, I read in the news this morning, he cozies up to Xi Jinping, and Xi Jinping, quite, I think, reprehensibly, does support Putin's regime. But as time marches on, as the war continues, as we learn more and more about the injustice of the cause on the Russian side and the injustice of the way they fight the war, more and more people around the planet realize that Putin's regime is toxic. And I know it's hard. I know you're struggling. And I know that time is ticking away. At the same time, I do think that over the world, more and more people are coming to see the justice on the one side and the want of justice on Putin's side. So that's one cornerstone of liberalism, recognizing that we're not always as bad as the simplistic realists would tell us, recognizing that people have consciences, that there is such a thing as justice and right, and that being on the right side of the war matters. Let's go on now to talk about the costs, particularly in times of conflict. Now, obviously, leaders too often launch wars without considering the full range of costs. It happens again and again. But whereas E.H. Carr says it's naive to try to promote economic interdependence, or the critics who say the Europeans never should have tried to cultivate a better Russia through cooperation, shared prosperity. I think it's not naive to try to do these things. I don't think it's foolish for us to tell our leaders before they launch these aggressive wars, this is going to be very costly. It's not worth it. We shouldn't do it. And I know that some of you, from knowing you over the years now, and before this, I reviewed a lot of your profiles to try to get back up to speed. I know that some of you are actually working now in the really important work of documenting the costs, the war crimes, the attacks, the violence. I think it's absolutely essential for the truth and reconciliation and the long-term judgment of history that is going to follow. We can't sweep these things under the rug. It's worth documenting the horrible violence because we've got to learn from these mistakes. Now, of course, we keep having wars. We keep having violence. That's obvious. But I do think that as a species, we are capable of learning. And I would even go a step further. I think we are making progress. I know it might not feel that way in Ukraine. It's easy for me to say, but we are getting better as a species, and we are ultimately going to achieve more progress. And it can't come soon enough, believe me, when I say that. I know you all feel the same way. But if I could, I'd like to reflect a little bit on the progress we have made. And I want to do that to hopefully strike some notes of optimism, to inspire you to continue the important work you're doing. It's not hopeless. It's not futile. It matters. It really matters a lot. And it's because of people like all of you working in the ways you are to try to achieve progress that we actually have made progress. But let me first talk some about the progress that we've seen. So let's go back to Mearsheimer for a moment. Remember this claim about international regimes. Realists maintain international institutions are a reflection of distribution of power based on self-interested calculations of the great powers, and they have no independent effect on state behavior. Right? That's his claim. But is that actually true? I mean, historically, empirically, do we find that international regimes actually don't matter, that they don't make a difference? Well, let's look at the record. Let's look at the liberal international order in the 80 years since it was created in 1945, as the Second World War ended. How well has it performed? And I'm going to give you some statistics here about people who have died via political violence. I want to be sensitive to the fact that this hits home for a lot of you. I'm trying to do this in a very careful way and to be very sensitive about that. But precisely because every life is precious and precisely because nobody should die via political violence, the numbers are important. And I want to grapple with those numbers because I think they provide room for hope. So 50 million is a massive number. And this is, in fact, a low estimate of the total deaths caused by the Second World War. This includes, of course, the genocides. But 50 million, I've seen estimates that go as high as 60 million or more. But 50 million, according to the Oxford reference here, is probably a reasonable low-end estimate. So let's say at least 50 million human beings were killed in this war, which of course was totally preventable. But what has happened since the end of that war, when we created the liberal international order? We've had a lot of people die, way too many people. But if we take all of the conflicts, interstate wars, intrastate wars, civil wars, genocides, if we take all of these conflicts and we add them together, we're short of 14 million people. Upwards of 14 million people have died due to political violence since 1945. Now that's 14 million too many, of course. But the scale has changed. It's changed in a really profound way. So in the 8 years, if we start the war as it did in China in 1937, for the 8 years of the Second World War, 6.25 million people were killed per year on average. That's 8 years, 6.25 million. And in the 80 years, 80 years, since we created the liberal international order, 14 million people were killed, which is 175,000 per year. At the same time, of course, the world's population has nearly quadrupled. I don't want to make light of all the deaths that have happened since 1945, and I absolutely don't want to make light of the deaths that are happening now in the war in Ukraine. But broadly, as a species, there's room for hope because we are doing better. Now, again, nobody should die due to political disputes. It's completely unnecessary. Given our ongoing failures, we have nevertheless managed to substantially reduce, in both absolute and relative numbers, the number of people who are killed due to political violence. And at the same time, we've done this having increasingly destructive weapons and ways of fighting. So again, I'm very conscious that it might not feel true to you in Ukraine, and I understand that perspective very much. But the global community provides some room for hope that if you can carry on, that all those things that Grotius says about our real nature, in the long run, we can get to a better place. It's not inevitable that we should be fighting all the time like this. Now, I'm going to be the first to admit that our major international institutions are deeply imperfect. Among other things, they're hierarchical, they're internally divided, and they are very often ineffectual. They don't solve all our problems. And very specifically, we've seen again and again and again that they let all of you down in Ukraine. They know better, and yet somehow, because of a lot of our leaders, including the leader of my home country, the United States, we're not using these regimes the way we could and the way we should to achieve peace and get back to prosperity in Ukraine as quickly as possible. We haven't done it yet. But they can do that. I believe they can work better for Ukraine. And so the question becomes, what can all of us do as individuals in the meantime to drive progress forward? Well, let's pivot now to tell some of the stories, just a couple, of those people, those individuals who created this liberal international order. I'm going to start with John Maynard Keynes, who I think is probably the best, the strongest case I can make for how individuals can change our global structures. So here's Maynard Keynes, born in 1883, died on Easter Sunday in 1946. In his own view, as his health faded, he died negotiating the Anglo-American post-war loan. It was enormously difficult for him to get the United States to support the UK after the end of the Second World War. The UK desperately needed the resources. Keynes was instrumental, personally negotiating, leading the negotiations at points, was personally instrumental in securing that support. And it did shorten his life as a result. But that was the work that he recognized as being truly important, not just for the people of the UK, but for the world, to try to see redevelopment happen as soon as the fighting stopped. Now, I can tell you a lot about Keynes. As my colleague, Professor Alden, mentioned, I've written a book in which Keynes is a major character, and I've done a large amount of research on Keynes and his work. I'm just going to highlight a couple things for our purposes here today. In 1919, Keynes, who was at the Paris Peace Conference, predicted correctly that the Treaty of Versailles was going to wreck the world economy and sow the seeds for another unnecessary world war. He then became the primary architect of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And more broadly, his liberal approach to global politics underpinned some of the design of the United Nations itself, and also the international trade system, what became the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which is today the World Trade Organization. But let me back up and let me walk you a little bit more clearly through the story, because there are some key lessons for all of us. So as I say, Keynes was actually literally in the room at the Paris Peace Conference where the so-called Big Four negotiated about the future of the global order. So he was there representing His Majesty's Treasury. He was so disgusted with what he saw that he left Paris and then wrote a tell-all book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, which explained this terrible peace treaty and why it was, in fact, not a peace treaty, but a declaration of continued conflict. Now, he was there in the room, so his rendering is quite insightful. And he says that essentially at the Paris Peace Conference, there were two broad approaches to how to approach global politics at the end of the First World War. On the left was the French leader, Georges Clemenceau, who himself was deeply realist. And on the right was Woodrow Wilson, who was a self-described progressive and liberal. Now, for Clemenceau, the problem was Germany. As a Frenchman, having lived through the Franco-Prussian War, he believed that the solution to world's problems was to take Germany back to the way it was before it unified and industrialized. Famously, Clemenceau said that he conceived of life after the First World War as a continual conflict, whether there be war or peace. Bernhardi said that politics are war conducted with other weapons. We can invert this aphorism and say that peace is war conducted with other weapons. So you can understand his vengeful, vicious, realist attitude. We must destroy Germany. We must destroy Germany. And that's what he, in fact, set out to do. On the other side, though, was the US president, Woodrow Wilson, who thought there might be a way to use international regimes and international cooperation to make wars less likely. He believed that if we had democracy, self-determination, and cooperation, it was possible to transform the international system and to allow smaller powers to have their rights recognized, to have shared peace and shared prosperity. I could give you a lot from Wilson. I'll just give you a couple key highlights of his vision. This is his infamous address to Congress, where he gave the 14 points, the basis on which the US would prosecute the war and the basis on which the peace would be organized. What we demand in this war is nothing peculiar to ourselves. It is that the world be made fit and safe to live in. Particularly, it be made safe for every peace-loving nation which, like our own, wishes to live its own life, determine its own institutions, be assured of justice and fair dealing by the other peoples of the world as against force and selfish aggression. Now again, I can't read those words without thinking about all of you in Ukraine. That's the liberal vision. A country like Ukraine should have its rights respected. And everybody has an interest in that, not just the Ukrainian people, the whole global community. All the peoples of the world are in effect partners in this interest. Unless justice be done to others, it will not be done to us. The program of world peace is our program. So some of you perhaps know his famous 14 points: no more secret alliances. We need to reduce the weapons. We need for all countries. We need self-determination, particularly for smaller powers. We need a League of Nations to facilitate cooperation, free navigation, and of course, economic integration. So Wilson had this vision. It's the vision that liberals have often championed. And yet Wilson failed spectacularly, as you all know, to secure that vision following the end of the First World War. It was Clemenceau's vision that won, this rapacious, vindictive, realist view. And that is actually surprising given the relative position of Wilson in the United States after the war. As Keynes writes, when Wilson left Washington, he enjoyed a prestige and a moral influence throughout the world unequaled in history. Additionally, realities of power were in his hands. American armies were at the height of their numbers, discipline, and equipment. Europe was in complete dependence on the food supplies of the US. Financial issues even more absolutely at their mercy. Never had a philosophy held such weapons wherewith to bind the princes of this world. One of the things I love about Keynes is he's such a powerful, such a beautiful writer. In other words, in modern IR terms, Wilson had all the hard power of material power, economic, political, diplomatic power, but he also had all the ideational power, the moral authority. People loved his vision, particularly in places like Ukraine, Central and Eastern Europe, where they were going to see their countries created, recognized, and finally now not stuck being ruled by some other empire. That was the vision, that was the promise. And yet the trouble was, Wilson had the vision, but he had no concrete practical plan. He didn't have specific detailed ideas about how to actually achieve these lofty goals. As Keynes writes, the president was not a hero or a prophet in the end. He was not even a philosopher, but a generously intentioned man with many of the weaknesses of other human beings, lacking that dominating intellectual equipment which would have been necessary to cope with the subtle and dangerous spellbinders whom a tremendous clash of forces and personalities had brought to the top as triumphant masters in the swift game of give and take, face-to-face in council, a game of which he had no experience at all. It's commonly believed at the commencement of the Paris Peace Conference, the president had thought out a comprehensive scheme, not only for the League of Nations, but for the embodiment of the 14 points in an actual treaty of peace. But in fact, the president had thought out nothing. It came to practice, his ideas were nebulous and incomplete. He had no plan, no scheme, no constructive ideas, whatever, for clothing with the flesh of life the commandments he had thundered from the White House. So again and again, Wilson is forced to work with Clemenceau's language. And all Clemenceau needed to do was to reconcile his vicious plans to dismantle German industry, to disarm German military with these abstract formulations. So for instance, rather than dissecting Germany, carving it up into small little pieces to ensure French security, which was obviously Clemenceau's real intention, instead, parts of Central Europe were reconstituted under Wilson's principles of self-determination. And if you look at the maps from the 1920s and 1930s of the European borders, you can see that, in fact, the principles of self-determination were not followed by and large, and instead Clemenceau's vision became the reality. Now, I want to be very careful here because Keynes is hugely critical of Wilson, but it's not because Wilson aspired to create a better world. It's not because Wilson was a liberal. Keynes too was a liberal. Keynes was angry and frustrated with Wilson because Wilson had the right values, the right ideas, the right vision, but he didn't have any of the right practical concepts or plans. As Keynes thought of him, Wilson was this idealistic fool who traded away all the practical requirements for peace to pursue his dream of remaking the world. And again, I think of Ukraine when I teach this or when I write about it, because all of you know well where the borders are matters. It's not something that ignorant people from Washington can just carve up your country and then say, that's it, job's done, we all go home, there'll be peace. Keynes understood in 1919 what all of you understand today, that understanding in a practical, detailed, local sense how to achieve peace is not simply a game for global leaders to do on a Sunday afternoon. It takes a lot of work, a lot of detailed knowledge, experience, and wisdom to try to figure out a way to ensure self-determination. It doesn't happen automatically. It needs to be an investment, and it needs to be supported politically. So Keynes understood this, and I think all of you understand it very well as well. Now, Keynes was right. He had stunning clarity in his predictions, sometimes about specific commodity prices and how they'd be affected by political events. In 1923, in January, he went to Germany to advise the German government on its financial troubles, and he predicted that there would be, at some point soon in Germany, a revolutionary putsch, perhaps in revolutionary Bavaria. And the only thing that Keynes got wrong was the type of socialist who would lead that. He thought it would be a communist, but in fact, of course, as you all know, in the beer hall putsch, it was a national socialist, the Nazis, Adolf Hitler, Hermann Goering, and company. Keynes understood that by not putting in those practical requirements for peace, whatever you write on paper, the deals won't hold, there'll be revolution, and there'll be more violence. Keynes understood these things, and he tried for years, decades, to put in place practical plans. The US needed to invest in Europe. The powers of the world needed to ensure self-determination, to defend self-determination, to stop larger powers from preying upon smaller powers. And Keynes wrote numerous books and countless articles again and again and again, predicting the disasters, correctly predicting them, issuing the warnings, and then asking leaders all over the world to finally do the job right, to take these challenges seriously and to build the liberal order that Europe so desperately needed. And Keynes failed again and again and again for 20 years. For 2 decades, Keynes was completely unsuccessful in changing the global order in all the ways it needed to be changed. Even as he's proven right, Keynes failed. It wasn't until the Second World War when Keynes was finally listened to. And that war, as you know, was so horribly destructive. But in that terrible violence, it both created an opportunity for Keynes to finally take a lead in developing new roles, new norms, and new institutions. And it created the space for those to exist. He had been thinking about the practical requirements for peace, how to achieve actual self-determination on a sustainable basis, how to have shared prosperity for 20 years. And he began to draft the formal plans for what becomes the International Monetary Fund. He began to put pen to paper in the summer of 1941. This is months before the United States even joins the Second World War. As you all know, this is the moment when Hitler invades your country, the Soviet Union, and is marching towards the capital, seemingly unstoppable. The Empire of Japan is not quite at its peak, but it's close to it. The fall of Singapore comes, I think, in February of 1942. So at this moment, one of the darkest moments, when the war is going terribly, the US refuses to join, and your country is being occupied, the rest of the Soviet Union is being occupied, that's when Keynes says, now is the time to put pen to paper and draft the post-war international liberal order. Now is the time. We don't wait until we get to the conference at the end. We begin the hard work now, so we're ready when the time comes, when the peace finally is won. So these writings from Keynes, beginning in 1941, become the blueprints for this post-war liberal international order. As I mentioned, he's the co-author of the Bretton Woods system, the co-author of the Bretton Woods agreements. Here he is at that conference in July of 1944, sitting down. He collaborated, worked closely with the Soviet Union. Ultimately, it was a great disappointment to Keynes. The Soviet Union did not join what becomes the International Monetary Fund. And yet Keynes had done everything he could to extend the olive branch to try to ensure that all the allies were on the same page. So Keynes is the strongest case of an individual who failed and failed and failed, but ultimately did find success. And I think that he is such an inspiration because it shows that even in these dark times, these dark moments, if you do the right things, your heart is in the right place, you do the hard work, you try to build instead of destroying institutions, you try to be peaceful in your manner and your approach, in the long run, it can find success. And it's because of people like Keynes that the liberal order was created and that we have become less violent than we were in the first half of the 20th century. But Keynes isn't the only person, of course. What of other people? Let me tell you a few more stories, and then I'll stop so we have time for discussion. Let's go beyond just great men. As all of you perhaps know, 10th of December 1948, the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which affirmed the dignity and worth of the human person, the equal rights of men and women. Now, this didn't come out of nowhere. People for centuries have been declaring rights and trying to fight to defend rights, but it's the first time the global community came together and formally recognized these rights. It was the product of an international group of thinkers and doers and leaders. Eleanor Roosevelt, First Lady of the United States, I showed you her with Lyudmila Pavlichenko at the start of the slides. She was the chairperson who brought this community together. Now notice the countries here who are represented. It's actually quite diverse. It's not just the US, not just the US and the UK. It includes people from Australia, Canada, Chile, China, France, Lebanon, of course the UK, and yes, indeed, the Soviet Union as well. All these people from these different countries, some of them allies, some of them rivals, agreed the crucial importance of recognizing human rights. Now, those are the most famous people associated with that document, this landmark document. But many other actors who are not famous people made discreet but absolutely critical contributions. Hansa Mehta was an Indian woman who is personally responsible for changing the text of the first article from all men are born free and equal to all human beings are born free and equal. Similarly, other women came to the fore and made vital contributions to ensure that the Declaration was more robust, more universal, and of course could withstand the test of time. Minerva Bernardino from the Dominican Republic included the equality of men and women in the preamble, which I quoted a moment ago. Bertha Lutz from Brazil and Isabel de Vidal from Uruguay, explicit support for women's rights and for non-discrimination, which you find, of course, in the Declaration today. Bagjo Begtrup from Denmark emphasized minority rights, consistently changed language from all men to all or to everyone. Marie-Hélène Lefacheux from France, explicit support for non-discrimination. Begum Shaista Ikramullah from Pakistan, equal rights in marriage, Article 16, came from her work. Again, you can imagine how important this is, particularly in a context where young girls are being married off before they reach the age of majority. And they have very few rights then once they're married. So this was near and dear to her heart, and of course, absolutely crucial in advancing women's equality. Evdovia Urlalova, the Byelorussian Soviet Socialist Republic, perhaps no surprise, advocated for equal pay for equal work, Article 23. So some of the very best bits of the Universal Declaration were the product of, in this case, these women from all different kinds of backgrounds from all over the world coming together and trying to ensure that it was more diverse and more inclusive. So let me just briefly conclude before we open things up. How do we pilot global politics? Well, some of you might know the famous line from Karl Marx, deeply pessimistic about whether any of us can really make a difference or that our ideas could matter. He said, men make their own history, but they do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already. Well, yeah, that's pretty dark, isn't it? Max Weber, though, was comparatively more sanguine, more optimistic. He said, actually, ideas can matter. They can work like railway switchmen, determining the tracks along which action can be pushed by the dynamic of interest. So ideas might matter. It's not just material interests and material constraints. I'm actually even more optimistic. You might have noticed. I don't think we're so tightly constrained. I think Weber's, I've written this up with some co-authors on a special issue of a journal that we're working on. I think that the analogy to railways, where you're stuck on these particular tracks, I think that's incorrect. I actually think structures are far more flexible, and they're often what individuals make of them. Instead of thinking about rail cars on tracks, I think of like the ship, a ship on the sea. It can go in so many different directions. It's possible to harness winds and currents, mechanical force. We have so many more opportunities to change the state of our world than I think we realize. I think the trouble is this pessimism that seeps in. It's a kind of lazy, dark, simplistic view of the world, but I don't think that's true. Where we go depends on how we pilot the ship. And it's not easy, but we do have the chance for progress. We've seen progress in many ways. Virtually all of our social, political, and economic process has depended upon individuals, famous individuals, less famous individuals, believing in the possibility of progress, building teams and coalitions to drive that progress forward, and then carrying on through even the darkest of moments. So how do we proceed? Let me close, if I could, with what's sometimes called the Serenity Prayer. I was raised in a very religious family. I'm not myself religious, and I certainly don't mean to advocate for any particular religious view. I think this is just a very good philosophy of how to approach challenges. And I recite these words to myself probably every day as I think about different challenges in my life. But it's attributed to Reinhold Niebuhr, the German philosopher. Lord, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So that's why I think the Education for Victory program is so important and so valuable. It's trying to help us understand what is possible to change, what's within our control, to inspire all of you to continue doing the hard work to make those changes and achieve that progress. So I'm really delighted to be with you. I thank you very much for the opportunity, and I hope that you are leaving this a little more encouraged, a little more inspired to carry on, because what you're doing does matter so much. So thank you very much.
Thanks, James. Thanks very much. I wonder if we have any questions or comments. Can be comments as well from the audience. Yes, Miroslava.
Thank you for the lecture. I think it's a good kind of reference point for our situation. However, a couple of points, since you are teaching this lecture for other students, a couple of points that I noticed on your presentation. One,
Sure.
You mentioned Ukraine war. I think we should be very careful with those words and name things how they are. And this is not Ukraine war, it's a Russian aggression against Ukraine, or Russia war of aggression against Ukraine. This is simple but very, very important for people who are not in context as good as we are. Second, Woodrow Wilson, a great guy, very progressive and liberal. However, he did not support Ukrainian independence. And Ukrainians at that time of the history actually were fighting for their independence for the first time seriously, and had a good chance to get it. However, the world, the Western world, supported this imperialistic idea that Ukraine should belong to Russia and Russia should take care of that sphere of the region. And that brings me to the point that basically misunderstanding of this war and misunderstanding of this region is related to little knowledge of this region in educational community and not only in the governments, in research, in intelligence. All of that is just related to really little knowledge. So what we have to do, all of us, to actually bring that knowledge to raise that knowledge, help people and help the world to understand what is going on. One more thing you did not mention, and it would be great to point out in your lecture, is about you talked about the New World Order and so on, and who contributed to the New World Order. I think two very important names, Lauterbach and Lemkin, should be mentioned because of their contribution to the World War genocide and to the formulation of genocide and to the Declaration of Human Rights that basically is basic for future justice if we are talking about justice in Ukraine. So that's my comments. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Should I say a few?
Let him, yeah, why don't you, if you want to respond now, and then we'll go to another question. Yeah.
Great. So thank you so much, Miroslava. I think I agree with everything you said. You're right about the way that we describe the war. I do sometimes, even in this talk, right, talk about Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. I think you're right that the labels matter a lot, and I'm going to take your advice and be more mindful about how I talk about this in the future. To me, it's very clearly a war of aggression. There's no question about that, and the label should reflect that. So I thank you for that suggestion, and I will take that on board. Woodrow Wilson, you're absolutely right. I didn't quite have enough time to go into Wilson. Keynes is partly hard on him because of these betrayals, because self-determination was really only offered or supported by Woodrow Wilson to certain groups of people. These were terrible imperialists, Wilson among them, and deeply racist. He was a deeply racist person, such that now the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton has stripped his name from the institution because the institution doesn't want to be associated with him. It is partly a question of him being an ordinary person making mistakes, as Keynes says, but there's also a deeply problematic side to his worldview, which wasn't yet fully progressive. And so I thank you for this point as well, and I completely agree that even though he had much of the right liberal thinking, it wasn't fully liberal, and it wasn't applied the way it should have been to actually support real self-determination. And your points about Russia's attacks on Ukraine these days, or the domination of the past centuries, are absolutely correct. And your last point about adding additional stories, I completely agree. If I have more time, I will work them in. I could probably trim some of the Keynes stuff and perhaps work in more on these points as well. Thank you so much.
To my university, that's why it's very important for me that
Right.
Lauterbach and Lemkin went to Lviv University, where we are right now.
Excellent. I didn't realize that. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for a great presentation. I enjoyed it a lot. And I have a couple of comments, so if you could comment on both these points. So the first point will be about the comparisons that you make about the casualties during the 1939-1945 and then in the post-World War II years. So I was thinking that it's not exactly a correct comparison. Let me challenge you a little bit on that, because the Second World War is a period of continuous breach of the world order. And the post-1945 is a period of relative peace as opposed to total war. So the question is how correct it is to compare the war years and peaceful years. Maybe the more correct comparison would be between, I don't know, Vienna Conference of 1815 and this period from 1815 to 1914. You know, after the New World Order was crafted and the period that followed after that, before the new breach of the world order happened. So that would be the first point. The second point, I got to thinking about believing in your cause and driving your motivation through it in a war. And you said that some of the Russian soldiers, they cannot sleep well in the night because they know they are in the wrong. But the thing I'm thinking about is that some of them actually do think they're right. Yes, this is brainwashing, this is propaganda, and the war between Russia and Ukraine is very much a black and white war, but not wars are like this. So many are more in the gray area where both sides think they are fighting for the right cause. And if you take the First World War, it's also who was in the right, who was in the wrong. And, you know, there is this saying that in a fight between the good and the evil, the one who prevails is the good one. So maybe if in the Second World War Nazis won, maybe we now will be teaching and learning a totally different version of history. So, and even, sorry for a protracted comment, but even this meeting that Putin had with Trump at Anchorage, when it was reported after that Putin, during a tete-a-tete, started talking about Prince Rurik of Rus, something like this. And you would expect a very realist perspective of him, you know, when you have just a one-on-one meeting of two leaders of two great powers, you would expect them to talk business, you know, like give me this land, that access to sea, those access to sea. But he actually talks about some, you know, 800 years ago version of history that exists in his head, which kind of gives you the reason to think it is ideological. He actually thinks he's in the right here. So it would be good to hear what you think about it, like how it actually resonates with these liberal ideas that you described. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name.
Oh, sorry, it's Yulia.
Yulia, nice to see you again. Great comments. Okay, let me start with the first one. It's not the correct comparison because it's wartime versus peacetime. In some sense, I mean, you're right. It's obviously very different. But in some sense, that's the point, is that in the first half of the 20th century, we kept having violence. And then in the second half of the 20th century, now the early part of the first quarter of the 21st century, we still have violence, but the violence is much less. And I want to try to emphasize that. In terms of a comparison to the 19th century order, here demographic data is very difficult to get in terms of people who are dying due to political violence. There are numerous famines in the 19th century that kill millions of people, maybe tens of millions of people, including in China, maybe especially in China and South Asia and elsewhere. And so it's hard to exactly pin down a direct comparison there. But if we were to just take the first half of the 20th century, I mean, these are facts that you know as well or better than I do. The First World War was about 20 million casualties. The Great Influenza, which followed, was another 20 million or so. And that, of course, was partly about the political violence that had weakened so many people that the virus is able to spread so aggressively and kill so many people. You obviously know about the Holodomor, the violence of the interwar period, especially in places like Ukraine, just horrific and way too much bloodshed. And then that's all a prelude to then the Second World War. So I want to emphasize that in 1945, people of that moment did not expect, they never imagined that we would have so much economic growth, so much demographic growth, and such peace and prosperity over the next 80 years. In fact, sort of ironically, the challenge of climate change is that the global order has worked so well, has given so many opportunities to so many people that now we're melting the planet. If you had told Maynard Keynes, if you had told Harry Dexter White, look, the financial system is going to be so powerful that we're going to have all this prosperity, they wouldn't have believed you. So that's on that comparison. On the question about soldiers, whether they sleep well at night, again, these are things that I read about and learn from other people who are there where you are and who see these things firsthand. You're absolutely right that people can be brainwashed, and it can often be difficult to determine who's right and who's wrong in a conflict. Very often, both sides are wrong, and I think that's marked by a lot of conflicts. Like you say, in this case, though, it is really clear. It is really clear. What are people from North Korea doing invading Ukraine to help Putin? It's just a terrible logic, and it drives people to do terrible things. And a sufficient amount of brainwashing probably could convince people that this is the right thing to do. But boy, it'd have to take a lot of brainwashing because it seems to any kind of sensible third-party perspective just obviously wrong and in every sense. Yeah, I think there might be a couple more hands, and I'm conscious of the time. There's more I could say, but let me pause here on this discussion for a moment.
For your lecture, my name is Polina Lee. I'm actually majoring in international law, so it was actually very relevant to my major. You said that all these important guys, they were shaping and writing some papers on how the world order will look after the war, even though it was still like 1941 and it was a long time before anyone hoped that war will end. I want to actually share that we as Ukrainians and Ukrainian government, civil society, academia, we are also not waiting. Of course, we are very hopeful for this war to end, but we are not waiting till it ends before shaping our future and still contributing to how the new political order and world order security will look like. Because Ukraine, you know, is actively participating now or is engaged in the accession process to enter EU. It's a nationwide exercise, and all the Ukrainian agencies and civil society, academia, business associations are involved in this. Although we have ongoing war, you know, also we are trying to contribute through the NATO and NATO system to how the security order will look like. So I can relate, and I think that we are not still working, but we are working very actively, and we are also, you know, that we signed this agreement with US on investment fund, and every year we have the Ukraine Recovery Conference. So we are trying to see already how we will rebuild Ukraine. So here it's very good to know and learn from the historical figures, but at the same time to see what is going on now, and that Ukraine is quite successful in shaping what is next for us. Thank you.
Great.
That's
Any
excellent.
other-
Thank you guys.
Go ahead. Sorry, your response.
I didn't have much to add. I mean, I think that's excellent. Great to hear. I'm not surprised, knowing some of you now as I do. I'm not surprised at all that you're all thinking and planning ahead. That's the purpose of this program, so far as I understand its mission. That is key. That's great to hear, and it's so valuable. All they can do is cheer you on and try to support in the ways that I can. I mean, it's important to recognize that most people in the world are on your side in this conflict. And I get that the level of support you're getting in a material sense is not what you need and not what you deserve. But going back a little bit to Yulia's remarks, you know, how can we tell if we're on the right side or the wrong side? Well, if you're on your own and increasingly on your own, and more countries disavow you, as is happening to Putin's Russia, you're probably on the wrong side. And if more and more of the world is saying, you know, this is wrong, what's happening here, the Ukrainian people have the right to have their own country and to have their borders respected. This is a fundamental principle, and there should be no deviation from that. That, I think, is a really good indicator that you're doing the right things and you're on the right path. I only hope that the path is gentler and easier than it has been.
Thank you very much for this great lecture. My name is Lilia, and I just have a couple of remarks to support what my colleagues already shared. This is about the historical perspective. Unfortunately, Ukrainians was, I would say, bestseller, because Russia all the time wanted to pretend for other history and was more vocal to the world and vocally sell not the truth, but they sell the true lie, you know, because they tried to catch everything which is, let's say, sexy right? So, and say, oh, this is we who did that, right? But they all the time just forget that they did it not alone or even not by their hands on their people, you know? So they just choose the sexy topic, the sexy period in the history and say, oh, this is we who made that. And this is the same with the Second World War, because they now just all these brutal parades in Moscow that they are so proudly say that we are just break the Nazi, but it's not true because it was just USSR flag. But in reality, who fight with the Nazi, it was Ukrainians and Belarusians people. Because Russia as itself and Moscow as itself never fight with the Russians people. It wasn't Russians' blood. They all the time uses someone who they occupied, invaded, and just sent to the front line. And if we look back, Polina already said, or Yulia, about the Rurik, probably Yulia said about the Rurik Kiev Rus, which is actually Russian, Moscow, nothing to do with that, right? So, but they just try to sell to the whole world that it's their history and their legacy, and that's it. So, just to be clear that Miroslava said that we need to have this fair point from the historical perspective, that we need to name the things as they are. It was Ukrainians, it was Belarusians, it was Ukrainian history, not Russia. That Russia just used their flags and their better sellers that we are, do not make things as they want to sell to the whole world.
Great. Over to you, James, if you have something to say.
Sure. I mean, Lilium, I think these are excellent points, very well made. I completely agree with you. You know, this is something that we see empires do a lot. It's kind of the imperial mode. Why would you fight with your own people when you can conscript or coerce or force people from your colonies to do the fighting for you? And that's part of the reason why Putin wants to rebuild the Russian Empire, because he wants to have the power that he can get. Controlling Ukraine is immensely valuable for Russia, immensely valuable. That's why he is so determined to try to conquer. And that's what he's trying to do. You're absolutely right. Labels matter. It's not lost on him. The power that comes from having all the people of Ukraine work for his purposes, that's what he's driving at. And such has always been the history. You're absolutely right. We think about the 1812 and Napoleon Bonaparte. Well, it was Cossacks, right, ultimately, who did most of the fighting. And it's important to bear these things in mind. And they want to try to frame everything as though it's Russia, but the reality is it's a very large group of different groups of people that Moscow tries to dictate terms to. I think you're absolutely right about that. It's deeply tragic.
On that, actually, for an optimist, you left on a pessimistic note. Anyway,
that's a shame.
Thank you very much. We have to go to the next event, so thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you in London. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. It's great to see you. Be well, stay safe, keep doing your work. I guess. Cheers.
Так ти представ, що далі я скажу слова. Just say that you translate.
Yes, I'm handing the microphone to Alexei.
Hello, James. How are you?
Very well. How are you, Alexei? Good to see you, my
Yeah,
friend.
in general, everything fine. Still alive. So best wishes to your family and to Brilliant, your three daughters.
All right, we'll do, and my best wishes to you and your family.
Okay. Yeah.
Great to see you.
James, one more pessimistic correction.
Yes.
There's casualties on your PowerPoint of the
Yes.
war. The
Yes.
casualties is around 2 million at this point.
Okay, I will update that. Thank you.
Okay. Stay in touch. Bye.
Okay, bye, guys.
Bye.